Oh, absolutely. They can. I mean, you can see examples of this in countries that invest heavily in retraining. We have an office in Singapore, and Singapore as a society is very good about seeing where the future job market is going to be and then investing public money and providing incentives to private companies to retrain and upskill their employees.
So in many countries, there's a fear of robotics, and it's in my view, irrational fear. But people are afraid of getting disrupted. Their jobs are getting disrupted by robotics, and what is the role of a human and all that. And then I guess we have a responsibility to try to be clear at communicating what impact robots will have to the workforce in the future. And so my question is, what is your take on that?
I mean, I completely agree with the need to communicate. And I think we also have to be honest about the impacts. So I think we can all agree that robots are largely being used in places where there's already a labor shortage. So they're largely not taking away jobs from people who have jobs today, but there are people who are, and they're creating more jobs on the other hand, right? So there are many more higher, what we would argue are higher value, greater dignity jobs that are created. But to the extent that people are displaced, they don't always have the skills to do those other jobs. And so I think we have to be much, much better about being clear that that is a real material near-term impact for those people, which there's pain for individuals. And we have to be better, at least, coming from the US, I can say we're especially bad at retraining and upskilling a population. And so to the extent that people are being displaced by automation, a lot of those people are, at least right now, frankly, being left behind.
So there's a need to have a more flexible education system and maybe also a more flexible job market and a security net under the workers. And those countries that have that, such as Denmark, here even the labor union is all for robotics. But in some countries, there is a problem actually, because people are afraid of being disrupted and get left behind, which can happen. So, but that is at the cost of progress, you can say, in society. And we cannot have a world where we stop developing technology, because the problems we're facing today with both the environment and other things, they cannot be solved without new technologies and without robotics and that kind. So I think it's quite important for many countries to begin taking this issue seriously of how do we empower our workforce or make the framework around our workforce so they're not too afraid of this change that's got to happen. And that's a big topic.
Yeah, and also avenues for lifelong learning don't exist, and it's not as easy for somebody to, for example, change career tracks without worrying about perhaps paying bills, and it comes at a huge cost, especially if you have families. Then you don't have this so-called luxury of pursuing what you're passionate for, but you're stuck in that cycle perhaps paying bills. So I guess these lifelong learning is also important.
But interestingly, some of the technologies that disrupt job market can also be the solution to these things. So online learning is, of course, we talked about, you mentioned Sebastian Thrun's early year impact on what is now online learning and so on. So there is also hope when technology will enable this.
And how do you think this can, in practical terms, happen? Can this get incentivized, for example? Can people get incentivized to take education?
Oh, absolutely. They can. I mean, you can see examples of this in countries that invest heavily in retraining. We have an office in Singapore, and Singapore as a society is very good about seeing where the future job market is going to be and then investing public money and providing incentives to private companies to retrain and upskill their employees. But I think it really has, this is something, it's one of those common goods that just has to come from public policy. And so it's a place where, again, the US, unfortunately, is poorly structured politically to actually make these kinds of investments. So I think the US is going to be a place where, as we see more adoption of automation, I think we're going to see more strife with people who are rightfully complaining about an economic situation that's not their fault, and they don't have a lot of good alternatives.
But I also have to say robotics get a lot of the blame, but IT is actually a bigger job disruptor in many ways. I think so like 20 times as big as robotics in terms of job disruption, but somehow doesn't get as much blame because robotics are like easier to understand and see what they do.
Well, and also, I mean, our the person who handles PR for us, this is his pet peeve is when people refer to a robot doing something and they actually mean a software agent.
Yeah.
So that's
Just-
people
if you
just
just
think
look
about
at-
it being
Just look
any
at
kind of
what the
automation.
word processor did to all these typing pools of, all the office work that happened before we got the word processor. It was
The calculator used to describe a person.
yeah,
So
that's true.
or computer, in fact, we
Yeah.
described a person.
Computer was a job.
Yeah.
That's funny.
So it's going in the right direction.
Mm.
I mean, and it would be crazy to try to pretend that you could stop progress right now and suggest that somehow the status quo is the right place to be, right? So I think it doesn't make any sense to oppose the innovation. But we really do have to be like very sympathetic to the people who are experiencing negative effects
You
from
need to
it,
take it
because there are
seriously
some.
for sure. And I actually did some work with the Danish government some years ago, and we talked about the disruptive effect of these new technologies. And the first industrial revolution had a huge disruptive effect. I mean, people moved from the farms to the cities and got completely different jobs. But at that time, the effect was slow enough so that the generation could absorb that. So the kids moved to the cities and the parents stayed back at the farm. So that way the disruption was handled by, say, generation gaps. But this time it's happening a lot faster, and that's where we have the problem. So even though this disruption is probably smaller than that first industrial revolution, it's still a big one, and it's happening a lot faster. So we cannot rely on the next generation to take over those new jobs, and the old generation to just slowly die out.
And
So-
where are the negative effects being experienced, as you mentioned?
Well, it's in, at least speaking for the U.S., it's in manufacturing, primarily in terms of the effects of automation and the effects of robotics. But it's not across the board because as you bring in robotics, like with URs and other platforms, there are new jobs being created. And so it's a question of but it's not everybody who can adapt to take on the new job of working with the robot versus the old job of doing the process entirely manually. And so I think there are some people that they're, through often no fault of their own, they're in a situation where they're not given the opportunity to adapt.
And isn't that also something that us as technology makers have to deal with? So if we can make the technology useful enough for those people who normally did the work, then there's actually a lot of value in keeping them in the company because they have a lot of knowledge about their workflows and what processes should be done and what good quality looks like. And that's things that the robots or the technologies don't necessarily have. So if we can make technology very, very user-friendly, you see, in theory, we can mitigate some of that negative effect of job disruption.
Absolutely.
And actually empower those people to be more value adding.
Yeah.
And that's the key.